In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Christ is risen.
Truly is risen.
Christos anesti. Christos voskrese. So today, we have Mother's Day. It's not a liturgical holiday in the church's calendar, but we acknowledge it and we honor mothers nonetheless. So it's only fitting that I start today's sermon with a quick review of what we learned last week about the holy myrrh-bearing women, those blessed women, and then look today at today's gospel and see how we can compare and contrast the two different encounters that we see with Christ and the two different attitudes toward obstacles that they demonstrate. The holy myrrh-bearing women on the one hand, and the paralytic in today's gospel on the other hand. So last week, the myrrh-bearing women, Jesus healed them. This is all we know. From 2 verses at the beginning of Luke chapter 8, we know that Jesus healed these women and that in response, they dedicated their lives to him. They couldn't imagine anything other than following him and hanging on his every word and attending to his needs, participating in his ministry, becoming themselves disciples of Jesus until the very end, when his male disciples had fled for fear and left him abandoned at the cross. The women remained faithful out of this gratitude. He had changed their lives. He had transformed their lives. And with a heart full of gratitude, they followed him even at great personal risk and against all logic. Now today, what do we see in the gospel? This paralytic. At first glance, if we read this story quickly, we say, boy, this man is much to be pitied. 38 years paralyzed. A whole lifetime almost, especially in antiquity when lifespans were much shorter. A whole life spent paralyzed and no one to care for him. And then Jesus comes and heals him. Another great miracle of Christ. And we move on from the story. But actually, when we start to examine it a little bit more closely, there's a lot of ambiguity. And to be honest with you, when I read the story carefully, when I wrestle with the story as I did this week, I'm a little bit annoyed with the paralytic. His behavior actually irritates me. Let me take you through a reading of this passage. So it begins at the beginning of John chapter 5, verse 1, and runs through verse 15. And it begins by telling us that Jesus went up to Jerusalem again. So in John's gospel, Jesus actually makes 5 visits to Jerusalem. This is his second visit to Jerusalem. He's still not known in the city. No one's really heard of him. And then the second visit, which the first visit was at Passover. And the second visit, we're not sure, the text tells us that it was at a feast. We think perhaps it was at Pentecost, or this period following Pascha, but before Pentecost, which is part of the reason perhaps the church places this feast now. And then it tells us that there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool. So the sheep gate was one of the many gates leading into Jerusalem in the northwest corner of the city, I believe. And in Hebrew, this pool was called Bethesda, and it has 5 porticos. 5 porticos were porches, were shaded areas, especially in the Middle East and this desert climate. The sun could be brutal. So these covered areas alongside this pool were very important. And there were 5 of them. And to give you a picture, we've actually found archaeologically, we found this site. It's actually at the site of what's known now as St. Anne's Monastery in Jerusalem, the northeast of the temple. And originally, we think that these pools were where people came in with their sheep, and the sheep were cleansed there before being taken to the temple. So to give you a picture, this was, you need to think of this pool as actually larger than a football field. It was a huge pool. It wasn't some small little pond. A huge pool, perhaps 20 feet deep in some places, larger than a football field. And it was actually two pools. It was kind of shaped like a figure eight. So it was one long rectangular, let's say, pool, but then it was cut in the middle by this fifth portico. So the porches were, of course, on the four sides, and then the fifth one cut across the middle. One pool was a little bit smaller than the other, and we speculate that perhaps this was to separate the genders, but we don't know. And Jesus comes upon this scene as he enters the city from the gate, which is now called St. Stephen's Gate. And he sees there a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, paralyzed, waiting for the moving of the water, the text tells us. For an angel of the Lord went down at certain seasons into the pool and troubled the water, stirred up the water, agitated the water. And whoever stepped in first after the troubling of the water was healed of whatever disease he had. One man was there who had been ill for 38 years. So there's invalids laying all around the pool. But Jesus, when he comes in through the gate, he fixates on this one man. He makes a beeline for this one man. The man had been there he had been paralyzed for 38 years. Now this is an interesting number. Why does Jesus pick a man who had been paralyzed 38 years? Why does the author of the gospel, St. John, mention this detail, 38 years? If we go back to Numbers in the Old Testament, after Passover, which is again this period where this scene takes place, after the Passover, after God had brought the Jewish people out of slavery in Egypt, and they were journeying toward the promised land, they were complaining constantly, grumbling against God. And at one point, about 2 years into the journey, as they're heading steadily to the promised land, the Jewish people decide to send ahead spies and scouts to scout this land that God had promised them and see, was it really any good? Was it worth all this trouble? They were complaining constantly about this trip they had to take. I guess it was so much better in slavery in Egypt. So for 430 years. So they send spies ahead. Let's see if this land really is all it's cracked up to be. Is it worth our effort? Is it worth following this God? And God, of course, is very dismayed about their lack of faith in him, their lack of trust in him. And so they go on to wander in the desert another 38 years, completing 40 years total before they are allowed to enter into the promised land. That whole generation that had been unfaithful, that whole generation, save a very few, save basically Joshua, that had come out of Egypt had to die before the new people could be allowed into the promised land, before they were ready. It wasn't a punishment, it's simply they weren't ready spiritually. Now, interestingly, this paralyzed Jewish man laying at the side of the pool, so close to healing, but 38 years sick, so close to the promised land, but not quite there. He wasn't yet ready. Jesus comes and finds him. And Jesus, when he saw him and knew that he had been lying there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" Jesus already knew the answer. Jesus already knew that he had been lying there a long time, but he asks him a question to draw him into a relationship, to draw him into a dialogue. And it's a good question. Did this man really want to be healed? He was laying there for 38 years. But was he ready for a new way of life? His whole life at this point, the only way he could have lived for this long was as a beggar, begging there for his daily bread and laying there, continuing to lay there and do nothing. If he were healed, if he could walk again, what kind of life would he know? If he could walk, he wasn't eligible to receive alms. Only those who couldn't work for themselves were eligible to receive alms. What was his life going to be like? Could he even imagine it? Or had he become so comfortable in his misery that he was actually afraid to change, that he thought he wanted to be healed? But did he really? The Israelite people, they thought they wanted liberations from slavery in Egypt, but did they really? Were they ready for a new life? a transformed life, one that was dedicated to God now, like the myrrh-bearing women. So Jesus asked him, "Do you want to be healed?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is troubled, and while I am going, another steps down before me." He doesn't answer the question. It's a simple question. Do you want to be healed? Yes or no? This is where he starts to irritate me a little bit. The answer should be simple. Yes, I want to be healed. Heal me. Tell me, what do I have to do? But instead, he complains. And he says how it's everybody else's fault that he's laying there paralyzed, because no one would help him. Now, how is it possible? He's been paralyzed for 38 years. He's laying at the edge of the pool, and he hasn't managed in 38 years to find a single person who cared enough for him to even give him a kick into the pool. Just giving him a swift kick would have rolled him into the pool. And yet he has done nothing. He hasn't engaged anybody. How is this possible? He says, "I have no man." Now, interestingly, one of the hymns we sing in the church on this feast today, Jesus says, "I have become man for you." You have no man, I have become your man. Jesus became incarnate and came like a heat-seeking missile to this man to heal him. Now, it's interesting, in the other story of the paralytic that we have in the Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the only other story of the paralytic is very similar. Again, just like this man, both these paralytics have no faith on their own. But in the other healing of the paralytic, it's his 4 friends who bring him to Jesus. And it's his friends' faith that saves him when they come to Jesus. Here, this man has no friends at all. So he can't go to Jesus. He can't be brought to Jesus. So Jesus comes to him. Jesus became man. The Word became flesh in order to save mankind, in order to save this ungrateful people. But not only this ungrateful people, all people. So he doesn't answer the question. He responds with this analysis of the situation from his head. He's not responding from his heart, like we talked about last week, like the myrrh-bearing women. He's paralyzed by this analysis. Paralysis, we say. It's everybody else's fault. And his attitude is he sees only problems. He sees only obstacles to the change that is so necessary to get him out of this paralysis. He sees only obstacles. He says, "Well, who's going to do it? I don't have anybody." The same question that the myrrh-bearing women had last week. They said, "Who's going to roll this stone away for us?" But what was the difference? They had already taken the first step on their own. They had already prepared the spices. They had bought the spices. And they had set out early in the morning seeking to honor Christ. And then, in their simple faith, they asked, "Who is going to roll away the stone?" And who rolled it away? God. With men, what is impossible, with God, all things are possible. With men, it is impossible. This was the myrrh-bearing woman's attitude, and the paralytic's attitude is, it's impossible. It can't be done. I don't have anybody. There is no one to do this for me. So he's thinking in human terms, not divine terms. He's thinking very humanistically. He's not allowing any margin for God to operate. So Jesus, as it says in the hymns today, says, "I became man to do this for you." So he tells the man, "Rise, take up your pallet and walk." And walk. And now the interesting thing is, the text says, "And at once the man was healed, and he took up his pallet and walked." So first he was healed, and then he got up and walked. There wasn't even an act of faith there, that he made the first step on his own, like with the 10 lepers. They were obedient to Jesus' word, and they headed off to the temple to show themselves to the priest, as Jesus had said, and on the way, they were healed. The same with the myrrh-bearing women. On the way to the empty tomb, the stone was rolled away. This man, nothing. And yet Jesus heals him as well. Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was. So the Jews intercede as the text tells us, and asks him why he was healed on the Sabbath, which is another story. And the man, he didn't know how to answer because he didn't know who it was who had healed him, for Jesus had withdrawn as there was a crowd in the place. So now think back to the women's reaction. The women's reaction was to dedicate their whole lives, their possessions, their everything to Jesus, to follow him in the wake of being healed by him, in the wake of their lives being transformed by him. Here's a man paralyzed almost his entire life for certain, 38 years. A man comes, you do nothing, and a man comes and heals you, and you walk again. And then someone asks, who was it that healed you? And he says, oh, I don't know, some guy came and healed me. I mean, what kind of answer is this? Again, the man is irritating me. Wouldn't you want to know more about this person who had healed you? Wouldn't you want to at least thank them? Wouldn't you want, perhaps, even from a selfish point of view, if he can do that, what else can he do? I want to see more. The man instead wanders off. Jesus goes and finds him, and he tells him, see, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse befall you. So now he lays an expectation on the man. And what does it say after that? After this, once there's an expectation laid on him by Jesus, that his life actually changed after this encounter with him, it says the man went away. Not like other stories in the New Testament, where on the heels of a miracle, it says they followed after Jesus. They followed after Jesus, or at least they tried, and then Jesus told them to do something else. Here, the man's reaction is to go away from Jesus. And he goes and tells the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. So he rats him out. This is this man's reaction. This is his humanistic thinking toward obstacles in life and his paralysis. Yes, now he's walking again, but where's he going? He's walking, but he's still not going anywhere. He has no direction in life. He's not following after the Lord. He's stuck in his head. That journey from the head to the heart still hasn't happened. The body was healed, but the soul has not followed. So the question for us, brothers and sisters, I think, when we look at these two encounters with Jesus and how lives were changed, the holy myrrh-bearing women last week and the paralytic this week, which attitude are we going to adopt? Which encounter will characterize us? Will Jesus change our lives and produce this gratitude that flows from the heart, that puts away this humanistic way of thinking, that sees only obstacles and challenges? And will we instead give gratitude to God, seek to go after him, and where we see obstacles, do what we can, put the first step forward, and leave the rest to God? Allow room for God to work. Another question for us. Are we going to be like the paralytic who was hanging around the pool, the source of healing, for 38 years and was not healed? 38 years. He was hanging out within a step of actual healing. Within a step of actual healing. It reminds me of the saying, what is it they say? That garages are for cars. So if I go hang out in a garage, does that make me a car? It's the same question they ask about Christians. If I go hang out in the church, does that make me a Christian? Well, not necessarily. This man was hanging out for 38 years next to the source of life, but he engaged no one during this time. No one. What are we doing in our lives? Are we hanging around the church for 38 years, hanging around the fringes, refusing to get engaged, refusing to form a dialogue with a spiritual father, like the dialogue that Jesus initiated with the man today? Refusing to get our feet wet? Or are we like the myrrh-bearing women who jump into Jesus' ministries, become disciples, become co-laborers with Jesus, contributing their money, their love, their gratitude to furthering his mission? What is our attitude? Are we going to remain paralyzed and stay on the sideline, or are we going to be motivated by this love from our heart for Jesus to leap into action that glorifies him? And finally, the question is, do I want to be made well? Do I really want to be made well? The same question that Jesus posed to the paralytic today, we must ask ourselves, do I really want to change my life? Do I want to? I like hearing about Christian living. I like hearing about how I can follow after Christ and his commandments. But do I really want to start doing those things? Or are they too inconvenient? Am I afraid of change? Am I stuck in my paralysis? The devil you know. Yes, it's miserable, but it's the devil I know. This is the world I know, and I'm afraid to step out of this comfort zone, quote unquote, which is actually discomfort, to move into a different way of life that would involve full commitment to Christ. These are the questions we ask ourselves, and I again tell you, when we look at these two encounters and these two attitudes toward obstacles in life, let's go with the myrrh-bearing women from last week. Celebrate again on this Mother's Day the example of those holy women and not the paralytic. Amen.